Recording in progress. Welcome. Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome to another live talk on the Lamim Young virtual classroom learning community experiment. um, Today we have very excited, honored to have with us coming from. Are you in San Antonio right now?
Yeah, currently.
Yeah. Coming from San Antonio, Tejas, bringing the chaos in Tejas, we have Claire Rousay. I hope I'm pronouncing the last name. Yeah?
Nailing it so far.
Claire Rousay, nailing it so far. Wish me luck. We are keeping it up. How are you, Claire?
I'm doing all right. I just made some tea. It's like the first time it's freezing here in like the last 12 months, so it's pretty wild. It's like
Yeah.
schools and stuff are shut down. So
That's actually, is it, hopefully it's not going to be another like disaster in Texas like last winter.
I don't think so. At least not right now. They're
Yeah.
predicting something else might happen, but I was trying to read a news article about it, and then I accidentally clicked on a Rolling Stone article. It popped up, and it was like Bright Eyes reissuing every record. I gotta get out of here.
Damn it. Well, you know how it goes. It priorities, right? Priorities.
Everybody
Claire,
got
Claire, I could give an intro for who you are. You make sounds. We'll start with that. Could you give us a brief self? Would you define your work for us in a little elevator pitch of sorts? What do you do?
Yeah, definitely. Um, so I think context for basically where it started to where I am now, I could do that in like a minute. So we're gonna go that route.
Boom. She's got it prepared.
Yeah, right. So grew up a drummer, trained percussionist, worked as like a session player, live playing person for like a decade. Um, since I was like a child, really, like playing gigs and stuff. And didn't really get into any kind of adventurous music, I guess is the right word,
Hmm.
until I was out of high school. So I'm a little late to the game. Uh, but still playing drums, kind of got into that through like noise rock, and that kind of devolved into like free jazz and free improv, and
Right.
kind of moved on from that, from just playing the drum kit basically, because I was trying to communicate too many ideas that playing like free improv percussion,
Mm.
like it's not limiting, but for what I was wanting to do, it was kind of limiting. So
It is
uh,
a instrument of, set architecture to some extent.
yeah, most definitely. And lots of people express themselves really well using that in that genre or whatever, but not for me. Um, so as time went on, I kind of got more interested in smaller sounds because coming from percussion and drums, it's like, well, what if I did everything on like a microscopic level and got
Yeah.
into the whole thing with like motors and small sounds and whatever like people were saying lowercase music was like 10 years ago or whatever that is, and
I
got
remember
really,
that. I remember that.
yeah,
Yeah,
it was like
sure.
a thing, and I guess
Felt
that's
like felt like people were put it was like how to describe like the twee equivalent of noise music. Like it was like hush. Like I don't know, like I never understood lowercase, right?
yeah, and it's like obviously when you're getting into this kind of stuff, it's like the more accessible the thing is, like you obviously get deeper and deeper into it. It's like that expanding brain meme or whatever,
Hmm.
and but I got into basically percussion and percussive music, but just within the context of like using objects and small sounds and things like that. Eventually was really interested in communicating even more ideas, so started incorporating like text and field recordings,
Hmm.
and a lot of stuff that really had to do with like human interaction, human existence, and like all the emotions and like weird things and baggage that come with that. And so now I guess I would say I don't know, I make music. I learned how to like uh compose using like harmony and melody in the last little while. I learned how to use Ableton. Like 2 years ago, I learned what MIDI was. That really changed my life. And like I say, that's all kind of, with a smile on my face, but it's my whole thing now, I guess, is like trying to communicate like real feelings, almost like somebody would like write songs or something, but using the tools that I know how to use and not necessarily um, going for any kind of like mastery or
Right.
you know all knowing vibe with
virtuosity
yeah.
virtuosity that kind of comes inherent with free improv, free jazz, like even in experimental music, what would be considered more music, like instrumental music in the foundational definition, I guess.
Yeah, totally. So it's like now I'm way more interested in communicating ideas about how like I feel, how other people interact with each other,
Uh-huh.
and kind of using more common either objects or tools or ways of recording rather than going to some crazy electronic music studio and trying to like use a synthesizer that costs more than someone's house.
Right, right.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a part of it in noticing some of your. I haven't, it's been COVID. I live in Puerto Rico, and COVID, obviously, like shows have been virtual in many cases, and you actually have quite the past few years, quite the collection archive of like of documented full studio recordings where we can see what's happening physically and hear sonically. And a lot of what you use is kind of feels in a lot of ways like how a prepared pianist would approach a piano player, like that, like everything in the kitchen sink, anything that could fit in like a plastic bag to be like dumped out onto a table potentially, that has some sort of small or potentially larger sonic quality, but might be on its own just a object, an isolated thing, like
yeah, no, totally. It's like
a motor.
prepared.
You talk about motors. I mean, like we look at like little RC, or these little things on their own. Like you wouldn't think musical or sonic object isolated, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think the first time I learned about anything, with true, serious composition and then composing was like prepared piano stuff. And I guess
Huh.
that's kind of what informs the prepared drum kit for a while. And then the drum kit went away, but the preparations kind of stayed around.
Mm,
Um, and I guess the focus became more like I'm really into like sound and like sounds and objects and the way that and sound association and the way those things interact. Cause it's like you can, drop a fork and a knife on the ground and you can be pretty sure like with just the audio what's kind of happening.
right.
But like obviously thinking like you're dropping a fork and a knife on the ground, there's so many just like associations and baggage that comes with that. Not necessarily like good or bad, but just like it is really interesting. You're like, oh, like that's the domestic item, and that's just that in itself just makes this one sound or this one recording just into this way like this different and very charged thing, and I think that's interesting.
Well, I guess I'll skip ahead in my orders of questions because you're tapping into important things that I want to talk about here, which is, um, you know, for those that haven't listened to your work, there's a combination of, like you said, found sound, field recordings, perhaps objects and percussion, combination of strikable, bowable, pluckable things, and then going so far as full on, piano, guitar, traditional instruments when it comes down to harmony, melody, and things like that, consonance and dissonance. But as far as theme goes, when I listen to your work, especially works that have text and field recordings, I am sort of brought to a stage or a scene in a lot of the work that you do. And sometimes you set it up for us quite literally, like with what was it? Postcard. What was the? I'm trying to get the my iTunes loaded here so I could just get the name right of the one that I was listening to more recently. A moment in St. Louis and a moment at the beach. Yes. And there's also an image on the front of I'm assuming a rooftop in St. Louis. But right here, you're kind of setting literal stage here, and that from there can imply many things thematically, including story and emotion and visual stimuli, related to the sound. How conscious are you of? Are you thinking about this beyond sound first and foremost, or perhaps there's a concept or theme you were thinking of first that maybe you want to find ways of evoking sonically, but the concept comes first? How is your thought process when it comes to that?
Some a pretty obsessive person, and kind of like an, I don't know, like extreme in the way that I obsess over things, right? So if I'm into something, I'm like all in. So it's like I got into text to voice, I just make text to voice, pieces. But as far as like that example that you just gave is like, well, first off, you're releasing something digitally, but you're accompanying it with an image, like a digital image. So that album art adds something, regardless of if the artist wants it to or not. But as far as like the order of things and how everything is built up, it kind of just depends each time. I don't really think when I'm making something, I go into it like I'm going to make a recording about my time in St. Louis. It's like I'm in Missouri and I'm hanging out with my friend Alex, and he has to go do something, so I go to the coffee shop and ended up hearing something cool. Then I go back to the place where I'm staying and there's an out of tune piano, and I'm like, well, I'm going to do this. And up until recently, I was kind of recording like all the time. So I would amass this like crazy library of like mostly useless field recordings. But sometimes you find the gems and kind of build out from there. So, once you kind of lay the groundwork with like, okay, well, all these recordings that I think sound cool were recorded in St. Louis. So like, what else was happening at that time? It's like, well, I was visiting for a wedding. Should I talk about the wedding? I was like, yeah. And it's like, I went to the wedding after party and was really convinced that this girl was gonna like want to go home with me. And she did, but then she was like, nah, actually not. And it's like that, once I was like kind of just working on something, because I'm always kind of working, building like this weird, whatever you want to call it, like sound collage piece. And then something like that happens. It's like, well, I'm not going to make a piece about St. Louis and then this experience here and not include that.
Right.
So
There are very literal stories within what might be like a diary, right? Like just
right,
kind of a cohesive, linear, event, right?
totally. And then, there are other times where it's like, if you want to use like the other side of that thing, it's like the moment at the beach or whatever. And it's like,
The B side.
yeah, like the recording of like really just one beach, but like when you say the beach rather than like naming a city, it opens it up so much more. And I
Right.
think a lot of my favorite things that I've consumed over the years, like regardless of like if it's like a movie or like a book or like like a novel or something like that, is like when it's open enough for more than one kind of person to relate to it. I think that's really important. So it really just depends. Like if there's something I have that is an experience that I want to communicate directly with very little room to kind of interpret it on your own, I can do that. But
Right.
on the flip side, it's like I do really like common, like, or I just like shared experiences, like common objects in the house. Everybody drinks out of a cup at some
Mhm.
point in their life.
Mhm.
Well,
Right.
like generally speaking.
Most most
Yeah,
people. We would
yeah,
hope. We would hope.
yeah. But
I,
like but not everybody goes to a wedding in Missouri and like doesn't get laid. So
well, it builds character, right? Specifically that in Missouri.
yeah,
All of that going on. Cousin's wedding, whatever the situation was.
it's a pretty
Um,
rough place to get rejected for sure.
it's very specific. I guess segueing from that and relating to story, whether it be site specific or just very specific and personal versus open to interpretation our beach, you know, like anyone's beach. Do you think that found sound and the use of containing some sort of literal sonic like thing, you know, like recordings resembling very literal things, that each of these could potentially hold some sort of emotional quality? Because like you said, the beach could mean anything to anyone, right? Like what was a neutral experience for you could remind me of the beach that I like proposed to my wife at or something like that. You know what I mean? Like you have suddenly a very distinct emotional quality to a sound that could be reduced to even a coffee cup, like you said, or whatever. Um, do you feel, are you conscious of these things even at that little kind of microscopic level of like, I'm telling a story, but also like this is meant to evoke a certain feeling, or is that also up to interpretation? Like, I guess what I'm asking is like, not just story and theme, but like mood to set the final feeling that the listener has when they are done listening to it. Is that something you really want to push on someone rather than leaving to interpretation?
Yeah, I think it works both ways. Like I said, I really like sound and object and like sound associations with objects, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the emotional component of that or whatever somebody associates with that could be anything, like you said.
Right.
Um, and I guess really it's just like the way it's being used in a recording. But sometimes going back to free improv or like people who do like prepared instruments, sometimes those things are blurred, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're like, or no, maybe somebody using purely electronics, like not even sampling anything or using a field recording. It's like this sounds just like a knife scraping on a plate,
Right.
but it's not. They like built the sound in their computer or something like that. And I think blurring those things too is really nice because somebody can hear one thing and then somebody can hear another thing. Similar to like I went to the beach and someone's like, well, I almost drowned at the beach. And the other person is like, I love the beach.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
yeah, and it's interesting when you put those things next to each other or within the same, piece of music or sound or whatever you want to call it. So
Right.
it's, you have a very clear sound of the waves at the beach, and then you have like a muffled conversation about something, but you don't actually know exactly what these people are talking about, but you can tell by the tone of their voice that
Mm-hmm.
like it is a serious conversation.
Right.
Um, or
Right.
like,
Yeah. It's not even
yeah,
just phonetics and the tone. Right.
right. And like sometimes that doesn't matter for, what somebody makes, and sometimes it does. And either way, those things are all like way more important. Like the sound selection, and regardless of what like emotional or like different experiences people can like associate with those objects. The thing that's most important to me is like um like sonic quality doesn't matter. I'm not very good with like making like hi-fi recordings or like really like mixing something really well. So it's like the sound selection and you know the potential kind of like interaction that the listener can have with those objects that I've selected or those sounds that I've selected. So it doesn't really matter if it's like a lo-fi recording or a hi-fi recording. And it doesn't really matter if you can hear a sound like barely, or you can hear a sound and it's super upfront in the mix. It doesn't matter if you think it's a fork and it's a knife, or you think it's a coffee cup, but it's actually like water dripping in this massive like dam or
Right.
something.
Right.
And it's just like the sounds are the most important things. And what you can take away from that is, I guess, maybe like the second most important thing.
Right.
And outside of that is like, I don't know, I'm not really trying to tell anybody what to think or feel or,
Yeah.
like I
Yeah.
just want to communicate something clearly enough to have it to get a reaction of some kind.
Right. You know, it's interesting because sometimes the reactions can be so, even if you are leaving much to interpretation, like oftentimes, like something that is a strictly sonic approach from the composer can end up with like the most, you know, unexpected emotional reactions from the listener that you have, you know, had no idea was going to occur. You know what I mean? Like oftentimes, like for me, it's like hearing like harsh noise, like is very positive and like invigorating, almost like going to the gym music or something like that. It's not brooding to me. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like beauty is in the ear of the beholder, and story and emotion can really be up to each person depending on what the artist feeds them, because you have an image here of like a rooftop. Like there are things we can pick out if we want when you provide more media beyond the sound itself, but we should start with the sound, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And well, it depends on what kind of, creative person. I don't want to say
Yeah.
like creative, but like, what kind of artistic person you are, right? Like if you really are somebody who works with sound, I would say that's the most important thing to start with. Or, depending on if that's what you're trying to communicate through.
Right.
Like I feel like album art, when people like make records and they're like the album art is, unless it within the creative process it kind of like worked together, which is something I also like to do. But it's like if you just put an image on something on Bandcamp for Bandcamp Friday and you made something
Yes.
and the piece of music rocks, but like maybe the image was a secondary thought, you can't pretend that those things like completely inform each other.
Yeah, they yeah, exactly. Like be real about what you're doing. But in
Totally.
this
Like
but that's candid though, just like the recordings that you make in some of the ways. Like you said, it's not about high fidelity. It could be voice memos, could be a little Walkman sound, you know, it's more about the immediate candidness of how you capture a lot of these sounds, I feel, that make it relatable, you know?
yeah, definitely. And I think like I don't know. There's like especially within like pop music or like rock or indie rock or whatever, there was a long time where people, and not even just that, not just music, but there's a long time where everybody is sarcastic about everything and nobody could just like legitimately or like earnestly like something.
Of
And I still
course.
think we're getting out of that. And that's still something that happens. And that's something I really am trying to avoid,
Uh-huh.
which is kind of why I like more than I maybe believe in my everyday life or whatever, champion things like pop punk music or like the Fast and the Furious movies or something like insane like that. I obviously am not thinking about that stuff every single day.
Yeah.
um but I really want to take away the idea that like something has to be one thing,
Right.
specifically. And like I think making music where sounds and ideas and feelings that you get from it are blurred and you can have different experiences and it's open enough, without like basically like an instruction, you know, pamphlet on like how to receive the recording, which is like a huge thing a lot of people do. And
Yeah.
like if they can, if that's something they want to do, they totally should.
Right.
But that's something I really try to stay away from because it is something that, um, people who did that around me, or even me attempting to do that, like really did form the way I make work now.
Right. So how do you feel navigating these labels that might be thrown at you throughout your many different, like instruments and, I guess practices? The free improv versus sound art versus, ambient drone, sort of like lo-fi, like warm tape drone. I've heard all these different things. If you go into like Bandcamp hashtags or like descriptions of stuff, you get into like the like every idea. If you could think of a genre, sub genre title, it's there on Bandcamp, you know? But how do you feel having started more in the free improv and even like free jazz, experimental music, improvised music world, as you've drifted more into quieter sounds, um, recorded and playback sounds, prepared sounds, as well as live instrumental versus object sounds? Like, how do you feel about all these labels that do exist? And the press will be the press, and academics and journalists are gonna put words to sound because they have to, but how do you define it?
It's kind of interesting because I do a lot of different things
Yeah.
and very intentionally. Um, Genres exist for a reason. People that are, get really grumpy about genres, um, being like, wait, this isn't accurate to what I made. And it's like, well, you made something open enough to have a genre put on it. So unless you're like really saying like, I made this music, and if you say it's anything besides this, you're incorrect, then you're kind of closing it off a little bit more. And I guess like maybe you could get upset about it. But I try to make or I have either over the course of just developing as like a person or an artist or whatever, but also just as like my interests change and I'm exposed to new things, different genres are thrown at different things. So like free jazz versus free improv.
Already so loaded, right?
So loaded, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, if I want to take my personal experience from that, I was in that world and I was identifying with like free jazz. Man, I just feel like I'm going like doing a gender talk also. I was identifying as a free jazz musician. But the more I researched and the more I kind of dove into that community, I was like, I don't think I'm in a position to use the word jazz to describe what I'm doing aesthetically, and also just like, I don't have the experience of somebody who truly is a jazz musician. And you can go whichever way you want with that, but it's like I'm like a white kid that listens to Fall Out Boy, and then I like kind of like got into like Dave Rempis when I was like 19.
Right.
And like,
But never a formal, no, never a formal or informal jazz, uppercase jazz education
right.
in that way.
No, like I filled in for like a high school jazz band one time because I could read the music, like because I played drums. But it's like I don't know anything about, truly living that out, because like everything does, you can like deconstruct stuff so much, and genre is the same way.
Right.
So especially things that are, loaded with different kinds of like, because different cultures create different things and sounds come from different places, and it's like really good to like check yourself on that. So it's like, okay, well, like free improv is maybe a better word for what I'm doing. And then I was like, oh, I'm kind of composing this thing, like I'm touring, and it's like I know how the arc of the performance is going to go.
Right.
It's like every night it becomes more and more of a composition. It's like, so am I really freely improvising?
Yeah,
And
like you get pushback from that where it's like your tour mates are like, that's structured improvisation. That's not free. I heard something similar at the last gig or whatever, right? Like
right,
there's conservatism in even the most avant-garde, niche left field thing, right?
right. So you're thinking like, so so you're like, oh, this is out music,
Uh-huh.
because they feel pretty inside the box. But I mean, as far as genre goes, there's so many things you can associate it with, but like genre exists for a reason, just like, language or like, physical, like bodily, like cues and things like that, right? Like if you feel reserved and you're like crossing your arms, there's so many associations with that, and you're communicating so many things with that. And it is helpful to the other people in the room to be like, maybe don't talk to her right now. And I think the genre is the same way sometimes, where it's like you throw a label on it and it's maybe you say my music's ambient music, but there's like a 15-minute section where I'm talking about like how amazing my tailor is and like how she made my pants fit perfectly.
Yeah.
And
You
like,
have literal comedy in your work.
yeah,
Right?
and it's
And
like, but if somebody didn't tag that as ambient music, whereas like there are parts of it that maybe could be, associated with what people think ambient music is. And it's like, no, the people maybe not, like they wouldn't have checked it out, or they wouldn't have like got that far into the piece and then been
right.
like, you know what, like maybe what ambient music is not what I thought it was, or oh, this is tagged wrong on Bandcamp. Like it doesn't really matter. It's communicating an idea is what I care about the most. So when somebody else is communicating their thoughts or experiences with something I'm involved with, it's kind of hard to get upset about that.
Right, right. But then to me it's like the difference between like uppercase and lowercase ambient. Like your music includes like ambient noise, lowercase, but necessarily would we call this like traditional ambient music uppercase in that way, because yeah, spoken word voicemails and what's basically like comedic monologues and things like that. You
Right.
include that in your shows as well. I mean, someone was telling me, one of my private students was telling me about seeing you in Austin one time, and like the audience was like wouldn't shut up. So you basically acted like a kindergarten teacher, like being like, I'll, just start basically like mocking them until they shut up, like, like interesting choice of like, it's basically like, I'm gonna just talk until y'all are ready, and that's like not something you expect from like, oh, the quiet, the ambient, the chill artist, all these things, right?
Well, it's like you came to the gig for challenging music. I'm gonna challenge you, I guess.
Yeah, yeah,
But I mean, I just think like communication, if that's the thing I'm so focused on and I, am trying to champion so much, why not use different kinds of communication?
for sure, for
Uh,
sure.
yeah, no, the live setting, I'm so happy that, well, I mean, shows are kind of on and off again,
Right.
but being able to play live shows in the last like 6 months has totally changed my thoughts and like approach to making music again. Because
Hmm.
it's like it stopped for so long and then it came back, and I'm like, there's so many more ways you can interact with other people now.
Right.
And and as a person changes, they interact with people differently. And
Right.
as the world changes, you interact with people differently.
How do you feel about the seriousness of the improvised or experimental music performance, and sometimes your transgressions against that, using comedy or just not taking yourself, being lighthearted about the performance, because how free improv, how brooding that entire fucking world is, and machismo, and just like, like looking at the OGs, like it, like the term free improv, like Evan Parker, like whatever. You ever see that dude smile? Like, like have you ever like seen them not just like grumpy? Like, how do you approach the expectation of what you're supposed to be acting like in these cases, right?
Right. Well, I also think, free improv, every show is supposed to be different and
Mm-hmm.
every person's supposed to have their sound. And it's like, well, if the expectation every night is that it's going to be dead silent, no one is going to react at all who is listening. Like, is it really freely improvised? Is there a freedom at all?
Mm.
But do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like the way that I can, I don't know, because I take myself, as serious as I think I should in different situations, but I'm very serious about like what I do, because it's like all I have. It's my whole
Yeah.
life, right? Like
Of
if I
course.
didn't do this, like the only two things I've ever done in my life is like make music and like work at a dry cleaners,
Yeah.
or like a restaurant or something like that. So it's like
Yeah.
I'm serious about it to where it's like it's all I think about. But in different situations, it's like, well, how much do I value um, communicating things exactly the way I want to over the actual experience of like being in that show, right? Because like every free improv musician or every like person who makes quieter music, they want that like tiny mixtapes review to be like you could hear a pin drop, and it's like, well, guess what? Your whole set sounds like pins dropping. So like perfect. But like it is like a thing to where you shouldn't demand so much if you're not willing to also like maybe surrender to someone else's demands that much,
Hmm.
and using comedy or anything like that, like especially in performance and recordings, it's like it doesn't make, I hope it doesn't make somebody take the recording less seriously, uh or like take me as like a comedian instead of like a musician or sound person or whatever.
No, of course not.
Right, but it's like I it's cool it's cool to do more than one thing, and
Yeah.
it's really nice to feel more than one thing. And what you're saying, like the Evan Parker thing, it's like, well, I don't know, smiling is fun sometimes. And there's a reason that you don't do the same thing every day, and
Right.
there's a reason that people get really depressed when they do the same thing every day.
Right.
So why would making things be different?
Yeah, it's like free improv is in fact not at all like I love that what you're saying. Like, where's the freedom in all of these rules and expectations that come with this music that, yes, I mean, at the time of its creation or whatever, might have been disregarding all preconceived structures and things like that, what you would expect even in free jazz, right? Uh, but the show experience and the communication and the relationship between artist and audience, these things are very set in stone. There's no freedom in that more often than not, right? And these, I guess, the experience as a whole shouldn't just be about listening to music. It's about seeing the performer. It's about being in the audience, about being in the space. All these things should be up to chance, just like your supposedly free improvised scaling or whatever you're doing, right?
Right, totally. And it's also like, it's not, when you critique so many things like we're doing right now, we're kind of um doing the same thing a little bit, where it's like people who, are, if you play like a free improv show and you're like, it needs to be this volume in the room, turn the air conditioning off, I don't care if you're sweating your ass off, like all these things. And then us here being like, you know what, that's not the right way to do music. And you have to strike the balance at some point.
Yeah.
And I think, I have like massive respect for people who play music that sounds like you're slowly closing an air conditioning vent, right? Like I play music with Jacob Wick, who's like one of the best people I've ever played a live show with. His
Yep.
He's like one of the best performers I've ever seen. The only reason I play with him is because I saw him play and was like,
First time I ever saw you was in Brooklyn, like probably a decade ago with Jacob.
yeah,
Jacob in Mexico, right? Still in Mexico, or
yeah, he's in Mexico City. And it's just
awesome.
like he's like a phenomenal performer. And that dude reads the room like nobody else.
Mm.
And it's like his music sounds like an air conditioning vent closing or somebody like blowing really softly into something. And it's like, but there's such an openness to it. And it's like, that's a perfect example of somebody who is like, I have the utmost respect for like the one history of this music. Um, people who are paying money and paying attention and giving time and energy to, make this thing into something that where people go to shows to even see music that sounds like that. But then also is attentive enough to be like, I respect people in the room too. And
Right.
like, if somebody's phone vibrates, it's like, well, it didn't ring. And it's also like, he's
Right.
probably going to interact with it. He's probably going to
Yeah.
like jump in front of his mouth and be like, bzzz.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, there's so many ways of doing it where it's like you can critique something so much to the point to where it's like what we're doing, it's like if we just kept going, we're on the opposite side of it but doing the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
This reminds me just like of the question that I was going to ask earlier on. It's a perfect segue for this, which is, silence doesn't exist unless you're in an anechoic chamber, right? And you're talking about that classic, you can hear a pin drop, like, the deafening silence of, that perfectly intimate recording or performance of free improvised music, that contrast between silence and noise and things like that. But if we listen to your work, especially work that uses what we might call like lo-fi electronics, tape, Walkman, these different playback devices, silence is more replaced by potential like room tone almost, like if we were to listen to one of the works that is like an indoor field recording, not necessarily a traditional field recording, but like in the St. Louis piece, like there's parts in the apartment, right?
right.
Like that's not silent, and yet we're in these moments where it's like it becomes that much more powerful to hear the clink of a coffee cup when otherwise there's just room tone. Do you like to designate these terms and these sort of like color schemes in your vocabulary, like true silence versus room silence versus material versus like saturation, because I feel like we can get all of the above at different points in your discography.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm an obsessive person, but like being like an absolutist or whatever you want to call that, like I don't know about
Less
that.
so.
Yeah, it's nice to use multiple, you know, compositional tools or whatever. And there are people that can talk about true silence or, you know, something like that who have experience researching that. And I think going back to saying like, oh, I'm qualified to do this, or like maybe I'm not the best person to be like using this term, um, like talking about true silence or like what ambient actually means, right? Like, are you actually listening to ambient music? Are you supposed to actually listen to ambient music?
Right.
Like all those things. It's like I didn't go to grad school. Like, and it's like
I
that's
literally just published a paper on the Patreon about like ignorability of ambient and things like that. Literally, like, you know,
that's so fantastic. Yeah.
I have an MFA in sound art. Blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah.
And it's like cool that you know exactly what silence means to you, but so many of these things are like, I don't know, subjective, right?
For sure.
Like just like genre. And I think compositional tools hold some of that as well, while some things are a little bit easier to define and a little bit more objective, or, you know, objectively one thing. But yeah, the whole the purity kind of complex of like grad school students, especially because I feel like people graduate from grad school and like you, even if you watch somebody who makes music and it's like they made this piece at this point in their life and they made this piece at a different point in their life, and it's like you can tell them apart, and that could be due to like a variety of things, right? Like different factors. For some people it's like they're in grad school and then they leave school and they're like, oh, I have different experiences. For me it's like I didn't know what experimental music actually was, I didn't actually know what jazz was, and now it's like, oh, I do know what that is and I don't do that. And it's like I wanted to do free improv and I realized what that actually means to me, and I was like, I don't want that. And it's like somebody else describing what I do as one thing, and it's like, cool, you can think whatever you want about it. It's really great that you're actually thinking, because like critical
Right.
thought is the most important thing that you can really do if you're trying to grow or learn or anything like that. So
Mm.
talking about the difference between, you know, either or I don't know, not to get on like a, you know, like a rant about it, but like
No, please.
when compositional tools, and I keep using that phrase, become like concepts, right? Like when a compositional tool becomes like, I don't know, like conceptual tool is not the right way to say that, but it's like when it actually gets so far away from the actual sound or the actual way the non-sound is being used, and it's like, okay, well, we've made it this far. Is this music? Is it not music? Is it even fucking art? Like, is it? I don't really know where we're going with this right now, but it's not where I want to be.
Theory, entirely theory versus practice in that way. And I mean, it reminds me a lot of like what turned me off about like a lot of the my composition experience as a college student, which was like having the a lot of serialists and like Boulez kind of 20th century theory heavy classical music being like shoved down our throats in contemporary theory class. And it's like we literally did not listen to music in like for that week. Like it was just score and theory and process. And you have Boulez on paper saying like if the process isn't like mathematically sound, then like it doesn't matter what the music result is, that you've done it wrong, you know. And like to me that was like, holy shit, that's fucked up. Like this dude doesn't even listen to music, you know. So it sounds like you're kind of tapping into that same sort of, like I said, conservatism that exists in even the most, you know, avant electroacoustic, you know, type of tape music or improvised music world, is that leaning too heavy into the theory removes what we're supposed to have at the end result of this, which is a a sound we enjoy, right?
Right. And I think the intention is really the most important thing. It's like, you know, like depending on what your intention is, like, do you want to be a composer or do you want to like be a theorist? Because there's like a lot of people that are really good at both of those things.
Yeah.
And it's like what the intention is, and then like the outcome is like, it's not for me to measure, but like maybe take a step back at times and be like, what am I actually trying to accomplish? Because like taking this one thing, and even if you're doing it in a way that is exemplary, and then trying to fit it into this like, no, this is composition. And it's like, well, I don't know. And brings it back to that could be anything, right? Genre
Yeah.
or whatever. It's just communicating ideas gets complicated the more you dig into it.
Grad school, baby.
Yeah, I know nothing about it. And honestly, I think that is kind of the reason I am the person I am.
For sure. For
But
sure.
also not knocking it. I've
Yeah.
learned so much. I learned so much from being a friend of a person who went to grad school. And it's like, it's not a choice I would probably ever make, but it's like some of my best friends like learned so much in grad school, and I'm just like, yo, dog, can you link me to that PDF that you can only get if you go to grad school?
That's right.
Because like
That's right.
I can't find that book from like the 60s that came out in like 500 copies, but if you have a PDF of that, and I would really love to use it because I want to reference it for something.
Yeah,
And
I mean
it's
you're talking just democratizing the ivory tower, which is like what exactly we're trying to do right now, right here, which is I feel like this is what we're having right now. These types of talks, these are the things that are for so long exclusive to the classroom and to those that can afford and those that are, know the right people or can pass certain entry levels to get in to these certain experiences where like you never know like what knowledge can be on its own outside of institution, right? Like you've learned so much just like not even like maybe your friends were in institutions, but it's not even that. It's just having access to the tools that they might have by default because they pay the tuition.
right. Yeah. And it's like, a lot of the reason I like using Common like I don't own anything like that I make music with that's really like expensive.
Right.
And that is an intentional choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I have like the cheapest MIDI keyboard and like mixer that I use when I tour. And
Mm-hmm.
if I need to get something that, has a little bit different or better capabilities, like I will do that, right? But something that's really important to me also is like, not fixating on fidelity and not fixating on theory and not, putting things above what you're actually trying to do, like in terms of importance.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, infiltrating
Yeah.
the grad school world is a cool thing to do. Or just, things change so much, and it's like jazz became, you got free jazz out of that, right? So
Yeah.
it's like, well, maybe we get free grad school out of grad school, or
Exactly.
or or just at least like start like
Yeah.
having a splinter in a way where it's like you can start building from those.
Yeah. Well, they tried it with the Black Mountain College, Cage and
Right.
Cunningham
Yeah.
and different folks, but like that was back when like American government would like give funding for that, and then we're like, after 2 years of that, I was like, nah, you're not getting money for this. Like,
Right.
you
Exactly.
want to
Like,
democratize these ideas? Come on, we're not gonna give you money for that. How can you profit off of this? Like,
right. Yeah. Exactly. And like obviously we could get into the whole capitalism and that that shit. But also there's different parts of the world where like things work in a different way, and maybe not necessarily like in the ideal that we're, or like the way that we're talking about things should be this way, or maybe things could be this way. But it is really nice to have multiple options, like to
yeah.
not just do things one way.
Well, speaking of capitalism, this is my last question for you before we open it up. I am a happy customer subscribed to your monthly Bandcamp page, which is, basically Patreon for Bandcamp, where you basically have access to the vaults if someone gives you X dollars a month, and the expectation from you is that you're kind of pumping it out for people, and this is brings to me the question of, because I'm assuming that you're able to make your living off of this by seeing like how popular the page is, which is awesome. Congratulations on that. Because like thinking about how a recording experimental artist can make a living in COVID is a huge question mark for most of us, but even more than that, reminds me of like the Dr. Evil Daniel Ek, the founder of Spotify, saying, well, if artists want to make a living off of our platforms, they got to think about releasing more than one record a year, you know? And that was the most like ridiculous statement to say, because like, I mean, why should they have to if they don't want to? But there are also artists out there that kind of are by choice, maybe by nature, putting it out there because the ideas are just going to be flowing in that way. Do you feel like there is external pressure working in now as the vocation of professional recording artists that has subscribers paying for content, right? How do you feel about the composer in the content age? Because I'm a music teacher. It makes more sense for me to like be doing edutainment on a
Yeah.
Patreon, and this is a class that people get access to by paying me in that way. But like, you're a composer and recording artist that has subscribers. How do you navigate that?
Um, it's kind of interesting, right? And honestly, the thing that I think about most when it comes to like Bandcamp and like a subscription service, right,
Mm,
is like I make money off of it, and I'm so grateful that I do, because
yeah.
I've done so many things in my life to just make money, right?
Yeah.
And it's like cleaning a bathroom uh, to make, the same amount of money as somebody who gets access to like 30 records I made
Yeah.
for a month, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm getting paid the same per hour that somebody is getting 45 hours of music.
I need to buy a separate external hard drive to actually get the hard copies of your discography. It's like I'm picking and choosing every week which one should I listen to this week, you know?
Yeah, but it's like it's nice to have options, but like I'm fortunate enough to do that, right?
Yeah.
And the reason that I, value it so much is because it's my favorite thing to do. And what I want to do my favorite thing all the time. So it's like every day I record something, not that I put it out or anything like that. But the reason that I've amassed such a collection specifically on Bandcamp is because I kind of control every aspect of that. So it's like I can do something like talk to my friend on the phone and just pop it in there and be like, if you want to listen to me talk to my friend about like, I don't know, skydiving, that's on there. If you
Yeah.
want to listen to a record that took 3 years to make and like a label actually put it out and you want to also hear that like an hour later, you can do that. And then the big thing was like signing up with American Dreams Records to start a little imprint called Mended Dreams, which is the thing that I run, that I put all of my subscription like releases through in a physical way.
Mm-hmm.
And touring kind of caught me off guard last year, and honestly I didn't do a very good job of mailing things out on time. We're actually mailing out a ton of packages right now, but there, there's a physical subscription option also, where it's like if you're into other things, where it's like you want to get less away from like composer and like whatever, and more of like, this is an artist, this is like a person that I just think that the shit they make is cool. You can get like hats and shirts and bags and stuff with like label
Yeah.
merch or whatever
Right.
you want to call it.
Right.
And it's like using like a subscription platform where it's like I basically am just like, this is my life and all of the things I've ever wanted to do and make, and I'm gonna put it all into this one thing. So the fact that people support that like so like in like such a dedicated and like almost like religious way is super cool. And it's obviously it is very beneficial because I get to like buy food and
Yeah,
like
to live your life.
my rent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it's like, well, if I'm making all my money doing not necessarily just Bandcamp, but like music in general, it's like I haven't had a job in a couple years, which is cool. And I don't know, I don't expect my life to always be that way.
Yeah.
But it's like while my life is structured the way it is, why would I not use all of that excess time to make more stuff? Because that's the reason I do it in the first place.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and why not explore different kinds of making things, right? Like design a tote bag or like write an essay or do a podcast or like make 100 records. It's like it's really cool. But yeah, there's a physical tier too where it's like you don't just get the download and have to find the hard drive or just stream it. You can get vinyl, and it's
Yeah.
like, you know, I think I can't remember what it is. It's like $12 or $15 a month, but it's like you get everything. Like I'm sending out a package right now for the spring where it's like vinyl, 4 tapes, a CD, a shirt, and it's just like that's for like the first half of the year. You just get like
Grab
every
bag.
yeah.
That's
It's just like,
incredible. That's incredible. So
but
like,
it's
how do you? Sorry, go ahead.
no, go for it.
No, I was just gonna say, how do you, when this is your favorite thing in the world that you would be doing no matter what, but now you don't need to do other jobs in order to feed yourself while doing this. How do you separate uh, the enjoyment from the vocation? Because, you know, I think that oftentimes people will burn out when the vocation and enjoyment are consistently melded together, right? And then eventually, you know, one the the joy tends to dwindle as the stress of a job might take over. And, you know, I guess that's a good problem to have if you're that you know, that busy a professional musician, right? But how do you in your day to day separate the two?
I mean, a good way to look at it is like, don't I, if let's say I had a different job that paid for everything, I'll always make work, right? Like I'm never gonna stop. It's my favorite thing.
Yeah.
So it's like if I did have that other job, would I be doing this? And I guess that's like the question you got to ask, right? So it's like if I had security from something else and I was working and somebody was like, do you want to do this thing? Or like, do you want to make a record that sounds like this? And it's like, well, if I had another job and the only reason I do this is because I want to, or I think it's like something that I would enjoy or something that would like benefit me in like a creative or, you know, like stimulate me in some way, like would I do it? So it's like, you know, why would you put something out on every Bandcamp Friday, right? So like I tried doing that for a while and I was like, oh, actually I hate this. I hate doing this so much. So it's like, okay, well stop doing it. And it's
Just
like,
control. You have control over it.
right, yeah. And it's like it's honestly really nice too, because it's like I'm in a position where I do have control over like things all the way up until like physical releases, right? Like if I want to make something and spend a lot of time on it and put it on vinyl, obviously I can't just do anything I want. But it's like I have things set up in a way where it's like, oh, if I want to do this project, I will. And it's like the only reason I'm doing it is because I want to.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start doing stuff that you wouldn't do if you found, you know, specifically with money, it's like if you had security coming from something else, whether that's like you know, a day job or like generational wealth or like, you know, whatever. And it's like, well, like, would you do it then? Is kind of like the thing and I haven't always done that, right? Like
Yeah.
like the reason I'm talking about it the way I'm talking about it now is because I learned.
Yeah. Right. Well, you know, I think that it's working quite well, and I appreciate as a listener just the variety that and the freedom that you have to post and to upload whatever you feel we should hear, like, you know, basically podcasting sometimes, like, you know, field recording, untouched field recordings, unmixed field recording, you know what I mean, like real just mood board sometimes, like this is what Claire wants us to hear, the artist wants us engage with, which is I think it's great, and I'm really happy for you that you have this backing. You know, I mean, like I didn't know about the Claire religion, but I guess that's a thing. That's a thing. You know, like
I just
on the
think, yeah, I just, you know, if you have something you want to share with somebody else, you should do it. And I have like a really great setup to do that right now. So it's like anything I want to share, I'm going to try to share because
yeah.
I'm in a position
Now you have the freedom to do so. It's
yeah,
fantastic.
totally. Yeah. Where it's like you don't have to necessarily crank anything out. Um, and there's like no deadline or anything. You're not like putting out a single record trying to make those Spotify pennies. And it's
Right.
like, yeah, you could just kind of make whatever you want. And like if people, I mean, people unsubscribe every day.
Of
So
course, I know that.
yeah.
I know
And
that.
it's like I mean, I subscribe to people like even the Kevin Drum subscription is kind of how I got into that, right? Where I'm just
Hmm.
like, I've subscribed and unsubscribed to that like 10 times.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's you know
No, you
you
can't take that shit personally when it's your job. Once you're at the point of like, you know, the level that you're comfortable, it's all ebb and flow. Like I know this shit. You can't sweat it because you're just gonna be glued to the count every day, right?
well, oh yeah, totally. Like, I mean, even with like social media and stuff, like people, it's the way people do that, right? Like, if you're not even music related, just like brands or something. If somebody wants somebody to like wear like Nike stuff, they're like, well, how much, like, how many followers do you have on Instagram? I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's not enough for Nike to send you a hat or
Yeah.
something. Viewing music or like making something that I legitimately care about. And like the reason I'm doing it is because I want to share it with somebody else for them to have like a reaction to it. And it's like, yeah, you can't do that the same way Nike's like trying to like shill hats, you know?
Well, it sells itself for those that truly care. I'm a
Yeah,
happy customer.
I'm glad.
Thank you, Claire, for being here with us, answering my haphazard questions, uh, and you know, allowing us to back and forth and spiel a little bit. I wanted to open up the Q&A for those that have any questions for Claire. I want you to raise your digital hand in the Zoom with your little hand raise icon thing, and I will attend to you in the order that it's raised, starting with Benjamin. You can turn on your mic, your camera, at least just your mic, uh, or you could put your question in the chat, but feel free to ask away, Benjamin. Benjamin B. Ben. Oh wait, I have to let you. I have to let you do that. My bad.
Oh, yeah,
I
yeah.
remember I said it's not a democracy. Okay, Ben, you have permission to unlock your stuff.
Amazing. I was I was frantically typing.
I was like,
um,
I can't unlock.
yeah, exactly.
Talk to me,
Um,
man.
yeah. Recently I've been getting ionized, and the ion pack people, and something they've been talking about a lot has been like the potential benefits, I guess, of having your toes in a lot of waters and working on a bunch of projects at once to minimize the emotional attachment to them in a way where, like, let's say I'm working on this one piece and I spend a whole year on it and it doesn't come out how I imagined and it isn't received, and you're sort of hit with this crushing feeling of I just spent a fucking year into that, or just an example of something like that. You're someone who puts out a lot of things all the time. I don't know if you have like opinions on that, or like the emotional attachment to personal work or projects and the benefits or disadvantages of that, or if you could speak on something like that.
Yeah,
Are your records your babies? You know, like that feeling we have, like emotional investment. I like that question. Thank you, Benjamin.
yeah, that's a good one. working on multiple things at once is something I've kind of always done. And I also think people who like make work and don't do it quote unquote professionally, or maybe they don't do it, you know, as a means of like living, you're kind of always doing multiple things at once, right? And I think specifically creating multiple things at once, I have too many interests and too many questions that I can't just do one thing at one time. So I guess unintentionally there is a little bit of like an emotional, I'm not as attached to certain things. Obviously, you put more time into something, the more you're interacting with it, you know, like, you know, you put like a year into a project, and over the course of that year, you also release like other projects or like do other recordings or play shows or whatever. And it's like, but you spent a year on one thing, and it's like, whether you like it or not, you did spend more time with that thing than something else. So I guess maybe the way I think about it, at least, is like, I try to do the whole like give 100% for everything. And that's something my parents taught me, actually. And that's something Christianity taught me, where it was like, if you wouldn't do it, you do everything like you're doing it for God. So it's like, I kind of take that with a lot of salt, a lot of grains of salt. But like, you know, if you instead of measuring it like you're so emotionally invested in one thing and then like it doesn't turn out the way you want it, it's like, well, why don't you just emotionally invest in everything, not just work, but like, I mean, like, I'm learning how to cook right now. My girlfriend's like a really good cook, and she's been giving me a lot of resources on like how to like learn how to actually cook. And I'm like, okay, well, if I can emotionally invest in this thing, but also emotionally invest in like a commission that I'm working on for an unnamed group or something. And it's like, and working on a record that's coming out, or like I'm announcing a record soon. And it's like, kind of maybe like emotionally investing in cooking as much as I am like doing something where I'm like talking to a magazine or like talking to somebody who's like, what color vinyl do you want? And it's like, you know, kind of leveling the playing field in terms of like emotional attachment is the thing that's worked best for me. But there's also like a tendency to be like, have your, you know, like have multiple irons in the fire in terms of like a capitalist kind of thing, where it's like, you have your t-shirt line and you have your music and you have like whatever. And it's like, that's less of what I'm talking about. And it's more of just like, I really like the experience of making music, but I also like the experience of doing other things. So it's like, I like collaborating, I like cooking, I like making solo records. And it's
Projects, like, having different
yeah,
projects.
Yeah, just, you know, don't value one thing so heavily, because then you've kind of, you know, turned into that thing almost.
Fascinating.
I'll give shorter answers. I'm sorry.
No. This is great. This was great. Thank you. And thank you, Ben, for that question. John Long, unmute yourself. Hey, John.
Yo, can you hear me? How's it going?
Sure can.
Nice. Yo, thank you so much for this. This is so rad. I had to jump for like a small second, so tell me if you've answered this already, but I'd heard you say before, and I think you said it during this too, that like at least there's a period of time where you're like always recording everything. And I'm curious to know like what the process looks like of going back and sifting through all of that stuff, and sort of like how you figure out like where are the bits, and like then how am I gonna, you know, how do I collate them and how do I assemble them and how do they turn into something? Part of the reason that I'm asking that question is because I'm starting to get into that myself, and like it feels overwhelming to like comb through all of that stuff. So I was curious to hear how you do it.
Great
Yeah,
question.
Couple ways. So first off, the way that I have like a couple Zoom recorders and I have my phone, and the way that I've set them all up to record is like, you actually have to punch in like the date and time that it is when you set it up and make sure that it's always correct, because that's like a really easy way to like at least have a starting point. But as far as like, you know, notable things where it's like, if you recorded 5 hours on October 5th, like you're not really gonna be able to find something. So it's like, obviously a lot of devices have like, you can like make a marker or whatever, but it still messes with the recording because you're touching the device. So I kind of like to make notes either like physically or like on, if I'm recording on a Zoom recorder on my phone, it's like, if something happens that I think is particularly interesting, then I kind of just make a note of it, be like, oh, today at this time, this is something that I thought was interesting. And that can go two ways, where it's like I hear a sound that I just think is like, that's perfect. I will use that for something because I just think that sound is so gorgeous or cool, or could be in a perfect spot, whereas I'm working on something and it's missing it. There's another flip side to that, where it's like, if I have a really emotional experience with something and I know that I'm recording, I also take note of that, because maybe I'm not totally tuned in and like listening because I'm feeling so much, but going back and being like, well, that was like a really emotional 30 minutes or something. So I'm going to sift through that and see like what my feeling kind of like manifested into like audio or like a sonic experience. And that one is the one that I really like. It's like, just make a note when something happens, and it doesn't have to be specific or anything. Just like, if something happens, like make a note, like, or take a screenshot on your phone and be like, that time, that day, something, and then follow, kind of like trace it backwards. The emotional one's really great. Like, even if it's a phone call where you're like talking, or you're just sitting there and like, and you just feel something and you're like, huh, the only thing I recorded was the air conditioning, but I know that I had like a mental breakthrough or something. As far as assembling it, you know how to make your music.
But does it spark joy, as Marie Kondo says? Does your field recording spark joy, or spark anything for that matter?
I mean, hey, she taught me how to fold a fitted bed sheet, and that is on a record, so it does spark joy.
There you go. Boom, boom, full circle. Thank you, John, for that question. Alex had to bounce, but I have them written in the chat saying, A, when are you coming to Omaha, Nebraska? And B, where do you hope to go with your creative process in the next few years?
Oh, cool. Well, I was supposed to go to Omaha a couple years ago, but the pandemic happened. I am trying to get back though. And I have some friends over there, so I really want to go to Omaha by the end of the year. I want to really tour in the U.S. Like, I was actually talking to my friend the other day about this. Is like, I miss being in rock bands because you get to tour and like do the same thing every night, especially touring in the States in a van or a car or whatever. So I think Omaha would be a very good stop for that, because San Antonio to Omaha flights are very expensive.
Really?
Yeah, small, like San Antonio is not the biggest place in the world, and Omaha might not be either. But as far as like creative stuff over the next couple years, I'm touring Europe this spring. I'll be over there for like 4 or 5 weeks and playing like a lot of shows. And I'll be back in the fall and doing some dates in March, I think, on the East Coast. Some of those have been announced already. So a lot of touring as long as COVID permits. I have a pop record coming out, a hyper pop record with my friend Mari, who plays under the name.
Oh, that's right. You were just posting about that. What's
On,
going on?
yeah,
What's
on
happening?
going full pop, trying to get signed to Universal.
Let's go.
Yeah, a lot of like using traditional like song form kind of stuff, less solo, but like in collaborative situations, a lot of that. Yeah, really just working with a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of collaborations, making a record with this Chinese rapper named Bloods Boy. He's on that Year One label, like the label with like Blade and Young Lean and all those boys.
All those sad boys?
The sad boys, yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, just like trying to interact with people who aren't like me. Because
that's totally not like you. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, just trying to make things with people who aren't like you, I think, is kind of how you learn new things, like
For sure.
being friends with grad school students.
Well, this is our little democratized grad school right here. And we have one more in the chat from Phil. Do you use any plugs, I'm assuming earplugs, or anything for ear fatigue, given that you're recording every day? Ah, yes. Dreaded ear fatigue. Not just a physical thing, but a mental thing too, where you're just like, I can't fucking listen to this recording anymore. I hate myself and I hate everything I've done today because you've just done 12 hours straight of it, right? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of the recording I do every day is like field recording, so I don't have a choice really. As far as like loud sounds and things like that, I'm like really careful. I like don't like to listen to music super loud when there's like a truck driving by or like a siren. Like I'm like the person that looks crazy on the side of the road, like ducking into the corner like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Because it's like I value sound so much that it's like if I lost that, life would go on, but it would be like a terrible thing for me. And as far as like recording, like, you know, in a studio, obviously, I record at home every day, and just taking breaks because you're supposed to walk every 45 minutes anyways. So sedentary kind of recording is
Yeah.
bad for you in multiple ways, and taking breaks for your ears is good regardless. Also, you're not very good at mixing if you listen to something for more than like an hour and a half, anyways. Like, I
That's
think,
what I'm saying.
yeah,
Preaching to
so,
the choir.
yeah, and just creating a quiet environment to sleep at night, I think, is a huge one.
Interesting. Interesting. Preaching to the choir here. Brian. Brian, would you like to unmute yourself? Brian.
Brian in the chat.
Brian
So,
in the chat. I don't have access to audio. Okay, they're going to type. Benjamin, you have a part 2 to your question? You want to fill in while Brian types? You raised your hand again.
Trying to think. I think I had to help someone in the house, so I'm just trying to think. So I might have to wait till Brian types.
That's okay. Calvin, you had your hand raised. Did you was yours answered? Your question answered? Oh yeah, you said in the chat that your question was answered.
My question was mostly answered, but if we're waiting to for Brian to type, I can ask like a slight addendum to that. If that's, can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Okay, cool. I'm wondering, like, when you're assembling stuff, do you feel like you know in advance like what's gonna sound cool, or like do you often find that you're like have plans of combining certain recordings together that are like maybe dashed against the rocks once you actually hear them together? Like it's like, oh, I thought this was going to be great, but it sounds like shit, or like it clashes for some reason, whether it's like emotionally or whatever. Do you find that happening a lot, or
yeah, all the time. I mean,
do you think you're, yeah?
um,
Sorry, just
no, keep going, keep going.
no. I'm totally done. I was trailing off.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, like things don't work all the time, right? Everybody has ideas that they think will work, and then they don't. Um, a lot of the times, the thing that's the most surprising, at least personally, is like I do something on one recording and it works really well, and I'm like, that was a fantastic combination, and also like that combination was a really good tool to facilitate either a feeling or a sound, or like fill in a certain like frequency range or something like that. And then I'll do it again on another thing. And I'm like, I did basically the same thing, sometimes even using the two of the same field recordings and just different parts of it. And I'm like, well, why doesn't the rain 45 seconds in to this other field recording that I sampled the first 30 seconds or whatever, why doesn't it work in this other piece? Or like, why doesn't it work again? And I think like a lot of it has to do with like just like your person, like being a person, and like you change. And also just like, I don't know, like if you, I'm really into Spotify playlists right now. I think they're really interesting. And it's like,
Oh no. Oh, et tu, Brute?
Spotify makes these playlists where it's like you find one song and it's literally like a scientific, like, you know, like just like an equation, or like I don't know, like it's a science experiment. They build this one kind of song that sounds like this, and you listen to every song on there, and it's like exactly the same, like same tempo, same key, like using the exact same vocal melodies, but just twisted in a little bit. And I'm like, why would anybody listen to like this entire playlist? Like this makes no sense. You just pick any of these songs that you like and then just listen to that one. And I think the same thing a little like applies a little bit in a very different way. So like what I'm talking about, where it's like I thought something would work because it worked before, but more than it working or not working, like sonically, is like my experience with it. I mean, like, well, why would I do it again? Which is kind of like why I make so many different kinds of things. But also, like, I make so much stuff every day that I just trash. Like, there's so many files on my computer that just go in the garbage. Like, you make a 10-minute track and you're like, I spent all day on this, and guess what? I also made a 10-minute track like a week ago and it sounds kind of like it, and there's no reason to have two.
Yeah.
And I like the other one more.
That's good to know. It's every, even if 90% of what you make is not going anywhere, it's the finding those little diamonds in the rough, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the journey, not the destination. Is
exactly.
Kind of a real thing.
Brian says in the chat, does mixing volume become as big a part of the composition as I receive it as? Like, does the microphone as a magnifying glass with regards to time and space get treated as a dynamic instrument when you're putting things together? And have you sort of learned to play with your mic of different recorders to catch an experience the same way you use a mic to capture a snare or a voice for different outcomes? Multi-part question, but a good one.
Yeah, really good question. Yeah. So I think at this point in my life, I am not the guy to go to get the perfect snare sound. But I am the guy to go to get the perfect door closing sound. And like the only way to do that is do it 100 times, right? Like there's a reason that people go to certain people to record very specific like genres of music. So it's like, like a Nirvana record sounds like a Nirvana record for like one person and one person only's reason. Well, not really, but like certain things sound certain ways because somebody spends so much time with it. And I think the only way to like find the way you really like the way something sounds is to spend a lot of time with it. So like I spent like almost a year with like a Zoom H5, I think, and like realized really quickly like all of the things that could go wrong with it. And then also like obviously anytime anybody records something on an iPhone, you can tell it's an iPhone recording if you are familiar with like the difference between something in an iPhone, because it's like everybody's like that iPhone compression, but that's like a legitimate thing.
For sure.
And I don't know, recording louder things with my phone sometimes sounds way better than using like a recorder, like a handheld recorder that costs like $600. And it's, well, the iPhone costs like $1 billion, but like it's the audio quality is like, legitimately like the fidelity is less on the phone, but like for some reason it just works better.
Yeah.
So like when you're listening to something that I create and it sounds like, it sounds like you literally took your ear and put it to the table and then ran your fingers across the table. The first thing I do is put the ear to the table, run my fingers across the table. I'm like, I want that sound. And then I figure out what is going to most accurately do that, which is why I think like recording, like if you're walking down the street and you don't have like a really expensive and cool like binaural like setup and everything, holding the field recorder like this in front of your face, like just like above your nose, is going to give you the most accurate version of what you're hearing. Obviously it's not going to be exactly the way it is, but really just from like experience and like using the microphone the way that you would use your ear is kind of the best way I've learned how to do things.
Interesting. So less about magnifying and more about like literally like emulating the human hearing experience, the stereophonic lives that we live every day.
Yeah, like physical distance I think is way more important in terms of like how I make work than really anything else. Like just putting something really close or really far away is generally the starting point for me.
Well, it validates me for having always been like, yeah, I'm gonna record this vocal line on my phone, like screaming loud, like the shit that you got to be real careful with on the fancy gear. Blast that into the iPhone or the iPad. Whew. It's good. All right, let's wrap it here. They had plenty of questions. I'm I know you're a very busy person and you got stuff to do. You got to cook. You gotta be in San Antonio doing San Antonio things. Remember the Alamo. You have to remember the Alamo is what you have to do. That's the most important thing you do every day.
Every day.
Thank you, Claire Rousay, for coming on. Everyone, please go to clairerousay.bandcamp.com and do yourself a favor. Sign up for that, very least the digital subscription bundle. You will get gigabytes upon gigabytes of recordings that won't do you wrong. And this is me coming from me, happy customer. Okay, this is not sponsored content. This is real. This is a real customer. She didn't pay me to do this. I paid her. Thank you, Claire, so much for coming on. Everyone say thank you in the chat. Say thanks on the interwebs afterwards. Enjoy your evening, Claire.
Yeah, you too.
so
Thank you
much.
so much for having me. I had a lot of fun.
I'm glad you did. I had fun too. Thank you guys for hanging out. See y'all soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.